The Wolf Dog by Walt Morey. Chapter 2. Kvik did not understand the cage. Charlie One-Eye led him up to the odd-looking thing, opened the door, and shoved him inside, slammed the door, and padlocked it. Now he twisted about the small enclosure, growling and snarling. He clamped his big teeth on bar after bar and bit and wrenched. It was no use. He was firmly imprisoned. Finally, he lay down and glared out at Charlie One-Eye and the blond young pilot, Smiley Johnson. "He's pretty smart," Johnson said. "That polar bear fought the cage all the way down. It didn't take this fellow long to figure out he couldn't bite through those bars. Sure glad they're not wood. I'd hate to have that character loose in the plane. Are you sure there's some dog in him?" "Of course. He wouldn't do anything if he did get loose." "Maybe not, but I don't like the way he keeps looking at me with those yellow eyes, and I don't like the way he clamps down on them bars." Charlie shook his head. "Scared of a Malamute with a little wolf in him, but not scared to fly this tin box in a storm. If you was smarter, you'd lay over." Smiley Johnson laughed. "Trouble with you is, Charlie, you're still traveling by dog team, while I'll be eating lunch in Copper City in 3 hours. Come on, let's load this bundle of dynamite." It took 4 men to lift the heavy metal crate with the snarling dog inside and stow it in the back of the plane. There in the inner dark, Kvik crouched in the cage with yellow eyes shining like burning candles. He was worried and uneasy in these strange surroundings. He heard the roar of the starting motor, and the vibration came up through the bottom of the crate like a thing alive. He felt the plane begin to move and gather speed. The motor roar swelled and swelled until it filled all space. Kvik stood up uncertainly and whined softly. He scratched at the bars and once again tried them with his teeth. He turned around several times in his close confines. Finally he lay down with his big head on his forepaws, resigned to whatever terrible thing was about to happen. The roaring went on, accompanied by a rushing sound like that of high wind high up in the trees. The black compartment where he lay felt insecure, and there was a rolling, tossing motion that never quit and would not let him stand. He crouched on the floor of the cage while these strange sounds and sensations ate away at his courage. He had never been cooped up in the dark, in a cage with no chance to move about, to fight, to defend himself, or to run away. He felt helpless and trapped. Fear, as he had never known it, came to him, and he began to whimper. In time, the swaying motions of the ship became sharper, more violent. They were accompanied by the sickening feeling that he was falling. Then momentarily they would be gone, only to begin again. After a particularly violent lurch, Kvik scrambled to his feet and tried to stand. In a frenzy of fear he clawed at the iron bars, then chewed on them, until blood trickled from his straining jaws. The motor roar quit suddenly on a series of jarring coughs. There was the sound of wind screaming along the sides of the plane, and again that sickening sensation of falling. The motor spluttered briefly to life, and the falling ceased. Then the motor died again. There was the feeling of sliding and never stopping, of spinning and falling without end. There came a sudden abrupt crash that hurled him against the bars of the savage force. A thunderous explosion and a blinding light. The cage went hurtling and spinning through space. Kvik let out one long, unbroken wail of terror that was lost in the tortured rending of metal as the plane struck the frozen earth. Smiley Johnson, Alaskan bush pilot, had come to the end of his luck. The storm continued to howl over the mountains and down into the valley where the wreckage of the plane was strewn. It spread a white blanket over the tragic scene, and over an iron cage some feet off, in which lay the battered, still form of a wolf-gray animal. The big body was pressed tight against the bars, as though with the last of his failing strength he had fought to get free. When Kvik opened his eyes, the blizzard was still raging, and night had drawn a black, swirling mantle over the earth. He lay still, not trying to move. He remembered the dark inside the plane, the musty, close smell, and the roaring sound that went on and on. He remembered the sensation of falling and the rolling and tossing that would not let him stand. He raised his head painfully. The air was fresh and clean and laced with the wild, sweet tang of the out-of-doors. He heard the strident lashing of the wind in the trees and felt the snow drive hard and fine against his face. The roaring motor sound and the falling sensations were gone. The solidness beneath him was the earth he knew so well. Through the blinding snow he saw the bulk of trees and brush. Once again the free world was all about him, but he was not free. He was still trapped inside the iron cage. Kvik tried to stand, but could not. All that marvelous strength that had helped him win the North American was gone. His whole body ached, and every breath was a stabbing pain. He rested for a little, then tried again. On the third attempt he made it, but would have fallen had he not leaned against the bars of the cage. He trembled violently, and his hindquarters refused to hold his weight. He sank back to the floor of the cage. He curled into a tight ball, as northern dogs always do during a blizzard, and tucked his nose into the thick fur of his belly. In a little while he drifted off, The storm became a remote sound that grew farther and farther away. The aches and pains of his battered body seemed to follow the sounds of the storm, and finally disappeared as once again he sank into a deep shock. All that night the storm howled over the mountains and down into the valley, piling the snow deep. Normally such a storm would not have bothered Kvik. He had often slept out in 40 below weather when snow drifted completely over him to form a cocoon in which he was comfortably warm. But his many injuries and the terrifying crash had thrown him into shock. His normal body temperature was lowered. Now the cold of the blizzard got through the thick wolf-gray coat. He shook uncontrollably, and his bruised, battered muscles stiffened. The long, bitter night passed on. Dawn came, gray and thin, and the storm still raged. It continued most of the day. Snow drifted through the bars of the cage and partially covered the dog. But not once did he move. Early in the afternoon the wind slacked off, and the swirling out curtain of snow began to thin. By the middle of the night the storm had blown itself by. A pale moon sailed into an ink-blue sky, and the stars shone with a frosty brilliance. The earth sank into utter stillness, held in the grip of biting cold. The blizzard had lain a deep blanket over the wreckage of the plane and piled snow up to the sides of the iron crate. To an eye, the wreckage was now only a mound of uneven snow. The cage was a stump or a rock with snow piled high on its flat top. Kvik awoke late in the day. He did not try to stand or move about. He knew there was no strength left in his big body. He was ravenously hungry. He'd had nothing to eat the day of the race, and only one small fish and a drink of water afterward. His mouth and throat were on fire. He twisted his head and licked snow until his thirst was somewhat satisfied. He raised his head slightly and looked out at the free world so near. He saw the snowshoe rabbit bound into the clearing a few feet off, then stop. It sat up and studied the odd object in which Kvik lay. A snowy owl ghosted out of the sky, talons spread. It struck the rabbit in mid-leap like a thunderbolt. There was a single agonized cry, then the owl settled into the snow and tore open the rabbit. Saliva dripped from Kvik's hungry jaws as he watched the owl gorge himself on the warm flesh. After a little he dropped his head again, exhausted by this small effort. He never knew when the owl left. The long night came with its intense cold and death-like hush. Dawn brought a pale sun that slid low across the sky but gave no warmth. All day Kvik lay curled in a tight bundle. A plane came over the mountains and dived low into the valley, trailing its thunderous sound directly over the wreck. Near the end of the day a second plane shot the full length of the valley and disappeared toward the sea. Dark closed over the earth, and the moon and stars came out. They threw long shadows across the snow. A wolf pack howled far back in the hills as it raced down some unfortunate animal's trail. The sound of their voices rose and fell and rose again, riding the frigid silence. Some time later a pair of coyotes woke the night with a series of shrill yappings. This valley was rich in game, and the blizzard had driven every living thing into cover. Now they were all out, hungry and searching for food. Woe to any animal without wing or swift feet or powerful jaws or claws to defend itself. The very cage that held Kvik prisoner now saved him from being eaten. With the dawn, 2 coyotes came out of the brush and stopped to look at the cage. After a time, they moved cautiously forward to investigate. They sniffed carefully about the cage. Kvik represented food, and their keen minds told them he was helpless, but the cage kept them suspicious and nervous. Finally, the boldest stretched a paw through and clawed at the body. So feeble was the life that flickered in the big dog that this failed to rouse him. The coyote next tried to pull him close so he could reach between the bars with his teeth, but he could not move the heavier dog. In time they trotted away in search of easier game. A snow-white weasel humped across the clearing within a few feet of the cage without stopping. His mind was on other things. A red fox came to the edge of the brush and hung there like a shadow, sharp ears pricked forward, while he studied the odd structure with the still form of an animal inside. After a moment he turned and silently disappeared. The cold sun was dropping toward the rim of the distant mountains when the lynx came. He was a big fellow, and in his prime. A full-grown lynx will fight a wolf and kill it, for he has not only teeth to fight, but with 4 feet studded with razor-sharp claws with which he can rip an enemy to shreds. The lynx was a stranger here, a long way from his natural habitat. He had wandered into the valley some time before, because he had found that it abounded in snowshoe rabbits, his favorite food. He stayed. Along with the other wildlife, he had been driven to cover by the blizzard, and had not eaten for several days. Since the storm he had caught 1 rabbit. This was not enough to sate the appetite of a full-grown lynx. He was hungry. The lynx moved through the snip valley on big fur-padded feet, seeming almost to drift over this deep snow. His tufted ears were pricked forward, and his round, yellow eyes glistened as he slipped silently from thicket to thicket in his search for food. In time he came to the small clearing where the wrecked plane and the iron cage lay. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the cage with interest. He saw where the coyotes had beaten a path around the cage, and he saw the still form of a big animal inside. Finally he moved forward, his stubbed tail twitching. The lynx stopped a few feet from the cage and examined it carefully. Then he walked completely around it several times. At last he sat down close to the bars and looked at the still form inside. He couldn't understand why this big animal didn't wake up or run or turn or fight. He reached a tentative paw through the bars, dug razor-sharp claws into the dog's flank, and yanked. He immediately jerked the paw out again and waited expectantly. The searing pain roused Kvik momentarily. His big head came up, his eyes flickered open, and his lips lifted briefly in a snarl. Then his head dropped again, and he lay still. The lynx reached between the bars again. He was bolder now. He was about to hook his claws into the yielding body and jerk it against the bars where his teeth could reach it, when he heard the sound. For an instant he froze, the paw upheld, claws extended. The sound swelled to a thunderous roar that filled the sky. A great white bird burst over the treetops and rushed down upon him. He streaked for the nearby thicket in utter terror. The bird passed overhead and disappeared, trailing the sound after it. Even before the cat reached the patch of brush, the lynx dived into cover and crouched trembling beneath a cluster of limbs. The bird did not return. Deathly silence settled over the valley again. The lynx lay and waited, in no hurry. Once he was convinced it was safe, he meant to return to the crate and the animal inside.